Good morning, everyone. In History of the United States Constitution, I'm going to put up hopefully a relatively brief video. I know I put up substantial videos that other producers have posted on YouTube for the 13th, 15th, 17th, and 19th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Doesn't mean there aren't other amendments that have certain weight and significance for our society. This is a one-semester course. We could actually have a course just on the First Amendment, just on the Fourth Amendment, certainly just on the 14th, and many others. So I try to put together sort of sounds terrible to say, as a hodgepodge of the last critical amendments that we should talk about before the semester closes. But we are coming to a close this semester, and I thought it only fair and equitable for you not to beat you to death with a ton of work near the end, but to cover the rest of those Reconstruction amendments out of the Civil War, and to cover, I think, two related amendments, really a third or fourth, but I didn't want to get into it. And that is, of course, reducing the age for federal elections to the age of 18, actually state elections as well. And that is, of course, Amendment 20. I can never remember the actual amendment, but I'll just talk about it really briefly. And that's Amendment actually, I should talk about Amendment 24 too, but I'm repealing prohibition, presidential term limits. These are all so very important, but I want you got to focus on some stuff, or we'll never get it done. And this is suffrage for young people. It's Amendment 26, and it was passed in 1971, and that reduced the age. Many states had the voting age at 21, but there was, and why 1971? We're still in the crux of the Vietnam War, and many people serving in Vietnam, losing their lives or risking their lives, were people between the ages of 18 and 21, and yet they didn't have the power to vote for the government that sent them into harm's way. And so we reduced that with the amendment of the 26th Amendment. And that's related to what I consider the 13th, the 15th, the 17th, and the 19th. And what are they? Just real briefly, the book does a nice job. The articles I put up do a much better job than I ever could. But the 13th Amendment came right out of the Civil War. The Civil War initially was, for the North, was to keep the Union together. And for the South, they argued it was over states' rights. But we know it was over the institution of slavery and whether it would be expanded into new territories. And ultimately, it evolved into whether it would be terminated completely. And that's exactly what the 13th Amendment did. Lincoln pushed it through. He recognized the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in those Southern Confederate states that were in rebellion. It didn't free all slaves by any means, and it only probably had the legal efficacy during the actual Civil War. If the Civil War ceased to be in existence, his order as commander-in-chief doing the Emancipation Proclamation would no longer have any validity, arguably, legal validity anyways. And so there needed to be an end to slavery through the recognition of a constitutional amendment. And that's the 13th Amendment. And why I encapsulated all these things together, when we think of our society having a lot of hypocrisy and failings, the beauty of our Constitution is we can fix it. And the 13th Amendment went a long way to that. It ended slavery in any form except one, and that is as a result of a legal term of punishment. You're sent to state penitentiary, hard labor, things like that. I don't know if states still have that stuff, but there you can do forced labor. And some people argue, well, that's because of mass incarceration of persons of color, that maybe slavery didn't end completely. I find that to be a bit of a specious argument, because the intent was clearly to end any form of indentured servitude. That's why you can quit your job at any time. Even if you have a contract for longer, you might be sued for damages, but you can always walk away from any kind of form of forced employment other than that, which is a legitimate, we hope a legitimate, form of incarceration because you violated some criminal law. So the 13th Amendment did a long way. We know the 14th Amendment was a recognition that African Americans were actually African Americans. They're human beings, and they also have the right to citizenship in the state they were born in, or any other state they tried to migrate to. We already covered the 14th Amendment in a separate section. But the 15th Amendment, although I thought, when I do the analysis and when I think of the historical precepts to it, I think the 14th Amendment arguably, and so women argue this too, gave the right to vote and participate in civic life, including the right to vote, because it says no state shall deprive its citizens of any fundamental law or equal protection law. And one of them would obviously be voting. Wasn't so clear. And so the Congress, the radical Republicans, and during their period of what we call Reconstruction, when the South was still being dominated by the federal government, North, they passed the 15th Amendment, not for women, though. It was giving the right for African American males of age to vote. Now, did people in the South and in other regions try to curtail African Americans' right to vote? Yeah, indirectly, I call it insidious racism. Jim Crow laws, the poll tax, which also I included, but there's only so many amendments we can talk about. The poll tax was banned. It's amendment number, and the poll tax is basically charging someone a tax to go and vote. And there was exemptions to it to people who had voted previously or had family or grandfather. That's the term grandfathering. They previously voted without having to pay the tax. So only people who had to pay tax were basically new voters. And who were the new voters? African Americans. And so it was considered to be highly part of the Jim Crow, litany of ways in which to keep African Americans out of civic life. And that is the poll tax ended. It wasn't really that long ago when you think of history. The poll tax was Amendment 24, and that was passed in 1964 as part of the Civil Rights Act. Really amazing when you think about fairly recent history. But the poll tax, think about it. You want to go vote, and if you're poor and you're impoverished and you're trying to put food on the table, obviously the go and pay and vote seems a bit ridiculous, and it was, and we did away with it. So just as way of mention, it's important to mention the 24th Amendment. So we got the 13th Amendment. It ends slavery for everyone, hopefully for everyone, at least in a direct form. We know there's indirect ways in which people were controlled, and many former slaves actually worked for former slave owners via the sharecropping methodology because of the economic oppression. But in terms of law, the rule of law being applied, slavery was banned. 15th Amendment allowed African Americans to participate in voting. And the 14th Amendment arguably made the application of law equal. And we know through case law that eventually became true with Brown versus the Board of Education, other major cases like that. The 17th Amendment is about more of democratizing society, taking power and giving it more directly to the people. A lot of people don't realize until 1913, the 17th Amendment, prior to its existence, dictated that state senators, or U.S. senators picked by the state, weren't picked by the state citizens. It was indirectly picked by state governments. And there's actually a movement today to go back to that. Some people say we shouldn't put the responsibility in the everyday citizen to go and pick their U.S. citizens. They're not responsible enough. They're not engaged enough in civic knowledge. And we should return it to the people who know what's best for their state, what the needs of their states are, return it to the state legislatures to pick the U.S. senators. I don't think that argument's going anywhere, because once you give a right, it's very difficult to take it away. And the right to vote, I think, is very, very much deemed to be a fundamental right of our citizenship. Imagine taking away. And some people say, actually, I know some people were in favor because, I think of my kids here, my home. I have, how many kids do I have now that can vote? 5 of my kids can vote now. 2 can't. But the 5 that can vote, they're all got some education, but I like to think, wow, their vote's equal to mine, and I know they're not paying attention to civic stuff the way I am. So a couple of them are, but certainly the younger ones aren't. And they often, I'll give them this. I actually get a couple extra votes because my kids always ask me, what should I go vote for? And I think they respect that, and they vote the way I suggest most of the time. And so there's the argument right there. Shouldn't it be a more informed, engaged methodology by which we pick our U.S. senators? And that's the 17th Amendment, taking that away, saying, no, it's the people that should decide. And there's a movement to do away with the 17th Amendment. I don't think it's going anywhere. And now the 19th, the big one. Women were fighting for other people's causes throughout history, starting with the Revolutionary War and before that. And they often didn't get to participate in civic life in a direct way. Over and over again, they were overlooked, bypassed, or ignored. And the most tragic one, I think, is with the abolitionist movement that they supported so strongly to end slavery. They worked so hard on that, and yet they weren't recognized. And they tried to argue in law that the 14th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Didn't work. And they fought so hard. It's a suffragette movement. In fact, the Seneca Falls Convention, I believe I put a video up for YouTube talking about the Seneca Falls Convention, basically rewriting the Declaration of Independence, saying not all men are created equal, all men and women are created equal. And they met in Seneca Falls, New York. And I went there about 2 years ago. I went to the museum there, the National Museum. And these women worked really, really hard. That's 1848. They don't get the right to vote until 1919, and ultimately it was approved in 1920, and that's the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the reason why I embodied in this very short last lecture, and not that it's lacking of importance, but the videos and articles I put up, I do a much better job than I do, and then also talking about the poll tax and also the lowering of the age to 18, we have become much more consistent with democratic values than our forefathers wanted us to be, because we recognize the need for change. And that's one thing the forefathers really had a pulse on, was the recognition that we don't know if we have it right. We don't know what changing needs and goals and aspirations of our society really call for. So they gave us the amendment process in the Constitution. And that's a very, very valuable tool. I mean, I didn't talk about some of the other ones about prohibition. It's a fun one. Lasted a handful of years. But there was a real problem, and there still is a real problem with substance abuse in our country. And one way they thought we could deal with it was to basically ban alcohol. But we know it had an actually inverse effect. People probably drank more on average, not from one individual didn't increase their drinking, but people who probably wouldn't drink otherwise. It was part of the anti-establishment culture really fostered a new level of drinking. So the Volstead Act, which was the one that enforced the Prohibition Amendment, really backfired in our country's history, and we know that was repealed shortly thereafter. And then we have other important amendments about Congress getting pay raises, or taking a seat in government that pays more than when they were actually in a different position in government. Kind of obscure. I think one of them, I don't know how important it is, but banning basically a president from serving more than 2 elected terms is in there as well. And there are many other amendments. And the one that's currently being circled right now is the Equal Rights Amendment for women. They have the right to vote, but they argue that they don't have pure equality in the law in all circumstances, and they want an amendment. It's been around since the 70s. It almost passed in the 70s. You need 38 states to approve it, and it either can't get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, and then 38 states to pass it. It's come very close many times, but it's still sort of in the hopper for potential amendments. But if along the way we do find a significant majority of Americans want to make changes to the Constitution, we can. And I'd like to close on a positive note. We have a lot of acrimony in our country politically. We have a lot of acrimony in our country culturally. But one of the beauties of the Constitution is we've come in the right direction with the 13th, the 14th certainly, which is not part of this end of semester assignment, but the 15th, and I think the 17th, because I hate to think that other people are going to decide who my political representatives are. I'd like to have that direct decision. That's the selection of senators. And the right for women to vote, I think, is critical. And it's really amazing how long it took for the federal government to kind of catch up. By the time the 19th Amendment was passed, many states had already, especially Western states, their new constitutions as they were becoming adopted as part of the United States, were enfranchising women with the power to vote. So states were ahead of the game, and it took the federal government time to catch up. But I try to leave you with a positive last assignment for the semester. I think it's positive because I think most people agree with those things. But if you want to, in your essay, you can talk about some of the pitfalls. Maybe people shouldn't have the power. I don't think anybody's going to argue against the 13th Amendment. I don't think anybody's going to argue against the 15th Amendment. If you are, you're going to get some rejection from me, because there's no question that the civil liberties and civil rights are so fundamental in the 13th and 15th. But some people could argue over the 17th about whether or not senators could still be picked. And also, I think the 26th Amendment, arguing about should 18-year-olds really have the power to vote. Some people think it should be down to 15. The older I get, the more I think maybe people should be voting unless they're in their 30s. Because I think with maturity and age sometimes come, not always. I have a friend of mine coming over in a while. I don't think he should ever have the power to vote. So it's not always an age-related issue. But anyways, be well. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And I hope you had a great semester. And anytime at all, Maybe we'll see you down the road in another class, but be well.